my great pleasure today to invite you to Hidden Histories of South Asian America. My name is Ananya Chakraborty. I'm an assistant professor of South Asian history here at Georgetown. This event has been made possible by many people. Most importantly, Emily Paraganian, our assistant for the program for the Georgetown India Initiative. The sponsors for this program are the Georgetown India Initiative, the Department of History, the Department of English, as well as a faculty seminar from the Office of Global Engagement, Theory and Practice, Humanities in the World. So it's my great pleasure and honor to actually introduce new and old friends today. Sabib Malik, who I had the pleasure of knowing during my grad school days at the University of Chicago, is the co-founder and executive director of the South Asian American Digital Archive, a national nonprofit organization that digitally documents, preserves, and shares stories of South Asian Americans, giving voice to overlooked histories and creating a more inclusive society. Gayatri Bahadur is the author of the Orwell Prize shortlisted Coolie Woman, which some of my students from last semester read with me and enjoyed very much. Her essays, reviews, and reporting have appeared in Laughlin Quarterly, The Guardian, the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, Dissent, and Foreign Policy, among other publications. The Commonwealth Writers Foundation in London recently published her fiction debut, the short story The Stained Veil, which we'll hear a little excerpt from today. She has received creative writing fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the New Jersey State Council of the Arts, and the feminist arts organization, the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund. She's currently a fellow at Harvard's Du Bois Institute, where she's at work on her second book. Last but not least is my oldest friend here. She and I actually were in school together.
Known each other since we were
10? Oh, God. Piyali Bhattacharya is a writer, editor, and writing instructor based in Nashville, Tennessee, where she is writer-in-residence at Vanderbilt University. Her work has appeared in Plowshares, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and many others. She's the editor of the anthology, which you can actually pick up today, Good Girls Marry Doctors, South Asian American Daughters on Obedience and Rebellion. And I can see a few nods in the audience on the title, which was awarded a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. She holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is currently working on her first novel, an excerpt from which won the 2015 Peter Straub Award for fiction. So what I want to do is actually to give each of you a chance to describe your work in greater detail before I open it up for questions. Samir, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I just want to thank Ananya and Emily and all the sponsors here at Georgetown, all of you for attending and spending your evening with us. My name is Samit Malik. I'm the co-founder and executive director, as Ananya mentioned, of the South Asian American Digital Archive. SADA is a nonprofit organization that's based in Philadelphia, which is also where I'm based. And our organization works to give voice to South Asian Americans through documenting, preserving, and sharing stories that reflect the community's unique and diverse experiences. I'll start by sharing a quote with you. This is a quote from a scholar of archival studies. And it's a quote that I often share when I start presentations, just to give a sense of how we think about the organization's purpose and its mission and its role in the South Asian American community. It's a quote from a scholar of archival studies named Jeanette Bastien, and her research actually looks at the U.S. Virgin Islands, which were at one time a Danish colony, and then in 1916, so 100 years ago exactly, where their ownership was transferred to the United States. And so since then, the Virgin Islands have been an American territory, hence the U.S. Virgin Islands. And what they did when they transferred ownership of the Virgin Islands was to remove the archival records from the islands and take them partly to Denmark, to Copenhagen and the archives there, and take the other part, bring them here to the United States, to Washington, D.C. and the National Archives. And so what Jeanette Bastien's research looks at is what effect it has on communities there to not have direct access to their own archival and historical records for now 100 years. And here's what she says. Next slide. She says, a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. So we started SADA back in 2008, 8 years ago, because we recognized that the South Asian American community, like so many other immigrant, minority, and ethnic communities around the world, has been a community without access to its own histories. And our fear really was that over time, South Asian American stories were in danger of being eroded or perhaps even lost entirely. So the work that our organization has been doing for 8 years is to document and preserve stories from South Asian Americans. Next slide. And we sort of define South Asian America broadly and inclusively to include those here in the US who trace their heritage in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the many South Asian diaspora communities around the globe. So that would we mean those who perhaps come to the US through secondary or tertiary migration through Guyana or Trinidad or South Africa, UK, etc. So if you go to our website, the URL is saada.org, saada.org, all the materials that we've collected are accessible, made accessible online. It's really accessible to the public. And what's unique about our approach to doing this work is that ours is what's called a post-custodial and digital-only archive. And what that means in more straightforward terms is that we are not seeking to build a physical archive of materials. What we do instead is work closely with community members, with organizations, with other institutions around the country to collect digitally and digitally preserve materials and make them accessible to the public. But if you're to visit our website, you'll see the same kinds of materials that you would see perhaps if you were to visit a physical repository, such as photographs. This is a photograph from protest for the Lease Drivers Coalition, which later became the New York Taxi Workers Alliance in New York City. A significant percentage of taxi drivers in New York are of South Asian heritage. You'll see magazine articles such as this one from 1923 describing a Supreme Court decision that barred South Asians from becoming American citizens. You can just go back. So this article, as you'll see, is titled "Who's Too Content to Vote Here?" And there's a photograph of a South Asian man with a caption that simply reads, quote unquote, "the problem," giving you a sense of the ethos of this country at that time. Next. This is a newspaper clipping from the archive from 1915 of the arrival of one of the very few South Asian women in this country at that time. The article, of course, ignores the woman and talks about Nose Diamond, latest fad arrives here from India. Next. You'll see community publications such as the two here. On the left, one in Gurmukh in Punjabi that was published from Los Angeles in the 1950s, and the right, Samar, the South Asian magazine for Action and Reflection, that was published initially in Texas and then later in New York City, starting in the 1990s. Next. And you'll also find other kinds of ephemera, materials that weren't necessarily meant to be collected or preserved, but that have ended up in the archive and they reflect on South Asian American history. This is, go back, sorry. Oh, one more. So this is a certificate of disinfection for someone who arrived into the country in 1910 and is being declared free of disease and therefore allowed to arrive and enter the country and then travel across the United States. Sorry. But because ours is a digital archive, we also have other kinds of digital materials, including this, a series of video histories with deaf South Asian Americans who reflect on their experiences, life in the United States. This is an interview with Madan Vishishta, who came to the US in 1967 to go to graduate school and then became a professor at Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. As well as other kinds of born digital materials. This is an archive website of the Takwa Core webzine, which is, the webzine doesn't exist anymore, but it's now archived. So those are, I just wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of materials that you see reflected in the archive, but I also wanted to share some of the other projects that we have to collect sort of living histories of South Asian Americans. And one of those in particular is called the First Days Project. This is a project that we started a couple of years ago. And you know, I often do presentations about SADA and about South Asian American history across the country. And after my presentations, community members would come up and talk to me, and they want to share their own immigrant experiences. And the story that I often heard from them was about their first day in the country. And even if it was a day that was 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, often it's a day that they remembered very, very vividly, and they wanted to recount, and they wanted to share. And we realized that those were the kinds of stories that weren't being collected anywhere else, and we wanted to start this project to collect these first day stories. And so I wanted to play just a short example of one of those first day stories. This is of someone named Ali Katau, who arrived from Lahore, Pakistan in 1981 when he was 20 years old. And he first arrived in Fayetteville, Arkansas to go to college there.
You don't have the people that you have been growing up with, your friends, your parents, your sister, your brother, and then you come over, and then suddenly it's a different environment, and you don't have a single friend. I mean, zero, zilch. You're starting with a blank slate. And I create friends very easily and all that, but that was, loneliness was the number one. I mean, if you want me to put it all in one word, initially, the first day was loneliness because you don't have anybody to count on. You don't know whom to ask for advice, and you don't know if they're going to give you the right advice. It was very interesting. It was different. It was, I think, helpless and loneliness were the two words that I would put the experience into. The first day. Now, ask me what, after a hunt, oh my God, I was a party animal.
I don't know if that reflects anyone else's experience or your own experience. Okay, so I'll end there, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of stories, the kinds of materials that we collect in the archive. Thank you.
So I want to echo Samit by thanking you all for coming and joining us and sharing your evening with us. And thanks to Ananya and the India Institute for having us here. So my book, Coolie Woman, is it reconstructs and reimagines the journey of my great-grandmother, who left Calcutta in 1903 as an indentured immigrant, and she was 4 months pregnant and traveling without a husband, an experience that was a typical one for indentured women. So the book tells the story of indentured migration from India to the Caribbean, Fiji, and Mauritius, and it was a migration of 1.5 million. 30% of those migrants migrating as laborers were women, and they constituted sort of the first Indians abroad in any significant numbers, but very much a community without records, and that was my primary challenge in researching and writing the book. So the material I was dealing with were colonial office records, and so what written material there was written from the perspective of colonizers, colonial officials, plantation officials, and what the book really tries to do is talk back to the archives and to render the experiences of these women who didn't have the power to write themselves into history using alternate methods. So I've got a slideshow for you, if we have time, let me know if we don't, which is set to a folk song from northern India, a bride song expressing her anxiety about leaving her home for her in-laws and fearing violence there. It was sung by a woman who was the daughter of indentured immigrants born in Guyana in 1920. She's the grandmother of a friend, my friend Rajiv Mohabir, who's a poet, a very great poet. And there are images, there are two sets of images, one set from colonial archives. They were images used on postcards used to sell the Caribbean to potential tourists. And the other set come from family albums, including my own. And then I've sort of ventured very recently into fiction as a way to give interiority to these women who are so absent from the archives. And I want to read you about 5 minutes of a short story I wrote called The Stained Veil. It's about a woman who was born in Guyana shortly after the end of indenture. And it's a story about 3 migrations. In the first instance, a bride leaves her father's home for her husband's home. That's the first migration. Then the couple migrates to the United States, to Connecticut in this case. And then finally the husband dies, and the migration is from this world to the next. This is Rani's story. She had spent almost all of her own life by his side. All her years, except the first 16, had belonged to Ramchand, to his shop, to his children. The 3 who survived and the 4 who didn't. Grief would collect beneath her bones in layers, a still but gestating thing, gathering and sedimenting with each infant's loss. This kind of mourning, this slow and silent unbecoming, wasn't one she could ever have imagined in her first 16 years. Those years had unfolded in the shelter of a father enlightened enough to let Rani stay in school, just long enough to learn to read and write and count, skills that later served her well as a shopkeeper's wife. She had been the cosseted darling, the youngest and the prettiest of the Mohabir daughters, the one who most gracefully wore the dainty shoes, respectable handbags, and store-bought dresses that were the relics of her family's faded prosperity. In those 16 years of rooted innocence, she had known place and its boundaries intimately. There was her family's rice mill, where cattle moved in circles in the yard, crushing paddy underfoot around a threshing pole. On Saturdays, she would go to Miss Evie's bungalow, Miss Evie who taught her to sew and knit, whose son Esau would one day become a composer of classical music in another country. Once, she peeked through a back window of the Kali temple down the road, only to run home sick to the stomach at the sight of the blood of a sacrificed goat. That was the extent of her transgression and thrill. The village sat unassumingly on the edge of endless rows of flower and cane, but hidden in its tall quiet, it contained well too much drama for the good of its inhabitants. Too much story, coiled like snakes in the cane. Her father used to say in rounded and swaying dialect, while observing his girl in some fracas, some private disagreement that had embroiled them. You get too much a story without yourself. That's what it was like in Lovely Lass. Ronnie crossed the boundaries of this world for the first time when she married Ramchand. Wim, his village, was a half-day's journey from hers, near the next big sugar estate down the coast. Her father had chosen for her a young man from a devout family, high caste but humble before God. What Ronnie had noticed was how handsome he was. His features symmetrical and angular, his face cut with precision, like a dark jewel. He was as dark as she was fair. When decades later she and Ramchand left for America in late middle age, she would remember this first migration from her father's home to her in-laws. There was nothing that could match it for daring. It was the most routine, inevitable thing a girl could do, and the most terrifying. After that, what move could possibly be as bold? Ronnie didn't understand it at the time, but ever since she was a child, the older women at work in the rice fields and the kitchens were singing her fate just as they sang her own. So many of the folk songs they taught her had been about a bride going to her in-laws' house, and a stained veil had often featured in them. It would be her destiny as it had been theirs. Their in-law songs, those sasaros, held a heroine's fear and wonder on crossing an unspeakable threshold. The songs had featured in the Bollywood movies screening at the Astor, the cinema house in New Amsterdam, the town nearby. Of course, Ronnie was not there to see Meena Kumari as the courtesan in Dil Hi Tu Hai, crooning Laga Chinari Medad, with eyes that mourned yet feet that stamped and hips that pivoted. The boys in the village would skip school to catch the pivoting hips, but that was their privilege. As a girl, how did she dare? She wasn't at the matinees as the boys were, over and over again, to hear the sensual tragedian sing, "How will I go to my in-laws with a stained veil?" A good girl from a good family, she would never settle into a scarlet cushioned seat next to boys who might wonder how precisely the veil had become stained. Was it from sex or violence? Did they know yet that the two could exist together in the same moment's loss? The image had come from Kabir, a saint poet from the land that her ancestors had left generations ago. As Ronnie sewed in the yard or helped her mother grind dal in the kitchen, she would chant, "You must leave your home forever. Putting on a veil, you will go to meet your beloved. You must leave your home forever. This veil of yours is stained," the neighbor women cheer. These words, written some 4 centuries earlier, would fly away from her as she mouthed them, their meaning difficult and strange. When she was big enough, the old women tried to tell her how to make sense of the poems. Imagine the Father's house is the world we know, the earth, they said, and trust that the husband's house is a higher reality, the mystical. Trust was their instruction and refrain. When you go to your marriage bed, they explained, the stain will be the spot that proves you are pure. But know also what Kabir knew, that the besmirched veil is the physical world, the impure body that we must all cast off in death. Rani was perplexed. Kabir didn't seem to know the difference between a dirge and a bride's ballad. Did death and marriage call for the same song? Rani might have been forgiven for wondering, as she intoned, "You will never escape this body's betrayal, wrinkling and bunching with time. You must leave your home forever." Kabir says, when you seek to understand, you will always fail. Kabir says, any song your body sings is a death song. What bride wears her veil in the presence of her beloved? Cast it off, you must leave for your real home. So that's the story. If we have time, postcards from Empire. So you'll hear this song, "How Will I Go to My In-Laws," sung by the daughter of indentured immigrants in Guyana.
helpless. Oh, no. चलो वो सखी चलो ससुराल कैसे मैं जाऊँ ससुराल चुनरी में लागल दाग मैं कैसे छिपाऊँ मैं चलो आओ सखी चलो ससुराल कैसे हम चलब ससुराल चुनरी में लगल दाग उनके शर्म लगे कैसे हम जा ससुराल चुनरी में लगल दाग कैसे मैं जाऊँ ससुराल आओ सखी चलो ससुराल में काहे के रोवे पिया के घर जाना काहे के रोवे पिया के घर जाना काहे के रोवे ए दुल्हन रोवे पिया के घर जाना पिया के घर जाना पिया के घर जाना ए दुल्हन रोवे पिया के घर जाना ए सासुरे मारे ननर गरियावे सासुरे मारे ननर गरियावे ए सैया मारे गले में बही डाल के ए सैया मारे गले में बही डाल के अरे बापू कैसे मैं जाऊँ ससुर में कैसे मैं जाऊँ ससुर के घर में चुनरी में लागल दाग कैसे मैं छिपाओ कैसे मैं भाई कमी नहीं बताता पाठ करता
She's just told him that he's full of shit.
Wow, that's really powerful. I'm still thinking about that. Anyway, I wanted to echo everyone here to say thank you so much to both Ananya and to Emily and to everybody who made this event possible. Thank you so much to all of you for coming out to hear us. The hidden histories of South Asia are indeed very hidden, and so I think it's just wonderful that we have an event like this. So I wanted to read to you from the introduction of Good Girls Marry Doctors, the title of which usually elicits interesting responses. But so I just wanted to, I feel like the introduction is a piece that sort of gives you an idea of what comes in the rest of the book. So I wanted to read you an excerpt from the introduction. It took me 8 years to compile all of the essays in this anthology into a book, and then to find this book a grant and a publisher. But the night before I submitted the final manuscript to the editors, I dragged the document into the trash can of my computer, shut my laptop, and cried. I cried for hours that day, heavy tears that held in their sheen the reflection of all the women who have had the courage to share their stories in these pages. Good girls marry doctors, it's true, especially in the Desi community. What then do bad girls do? Surely, I reasoned in that moment, bad girls write publicly about their parents and guardians. Bad girls take all the sacrifices their immigrant parents made for them, all the tenderness and support their parents gave up in their homelands, all the toil it took to earn livings and build homes in North America, and twist them into perverted abuses. Bad girls forget how deeply they have been loved. At least that's what it often feels like to be writing essays like the ones in this volume. We write and then we think, oh God, what if my parents read this? What we mean by that is that we're worried that our parents will see these essays in which we, their daughters, have drawn up a list of grievances about our childhoods, our adolescenthoods, and our adulthoods, and they will assume that we have forgotten their side of the story. They will think that all the lessons they taught us about honor and respect mean nothing to us, that all their sacrifices and hard work to raise us in a foreign land have resulted in this, a burning at the stake of their methods and philosophies. I don't blame them for feeling this way. I can only imagine how attacked they must feel. Envisioning their sorrow upon reading a book like this is enough to keep most of us from wanting to publish it at all. Yet our ambivalence to their reactions to the work is precisely the reason why the work needs to be done. Because in the basket they packed for us, full of the ingredients necessary to have a successful life, they sometimes forgot to include the ingredients necessary to live a fulfilled life. Success is a funny thing for us good girls. Most of us have been schooled by our parents and communities since we were children to not only strive for, but also to desire a certain kind of life. Academic rigor, followed by a well-respected job, but within a career which might allow us to stay at home and raise our children once we marry a hard-working, respectful, and high-earning lazy man. Speaking of children, we should raise ours the way we were raised, with a good understanding of the language and ethnic traditions that were handed down to us by our parents. It is on the shoulders of good girls to carry forward cultural legacies. But many of us didn't fit this mold. We had political opinions, sexual desires, professional passions, and a whole host of other cravings that clawed at us. And yet the idea of rebelling was scary. We were brought up to believe that there was no bond more sacred than that between us and our parents, and that nothing could be more dishonorable than to bring the shame of disobedience on our families. After all, didn't our parents have our best interests at heart? More importantly, if we were going to give up the safety of the good girl mold, what other kinds of safety would we lose? Without the approval of our parents, how would we pin down and draw out the maps of our bodies, our spirits? These were terrifying questions to which there were no answers. At some point in time, each of us was on the precipice of good girldom, petrified of what might happen if we chose to jump off the edge. But none of these thoughts were as daunting as the thought of walking through our lives for decades on end in shoes that didn't fit. We jumped. As expected, there were consequences. In some cases, our parents were so furious that we were no longer able to have relationships with them. In others, the landing was much softer than expected. But in most cases, we landed somewhere in the middle. Neither were we excommunicated from our families and communities, nor could we be who we wanted to be, free of judgment and constant shaming. We were relentlessly told that we had turned into bad girls, that we had brought indignity and pain to our families, that we were the reasons for which our parents could no longer show their faces in society. Navigating the terrain in that moment, the instant after the fall but before the dust settled, the agony of impact before the healing process began, is what many of these essays are about. But the essays move through other landscapes too. Many explore the fact that there were also benefits to our having taken the risk of this plunge. Down we fell, through the rabbit hole and into an alternate universe, a world full of feminists and activists and artists and nonconformists of all kinds. We were enraptured by the conversations taking place around us, enthralled at the thousands of possibilities for the road ahead. That's when we discovered that there was one more step required if we wanted to be at peace with our new selves. We had to find our tribe. It wasn't enough to simply walk away from the safety of the known given world of our parents. We couldn't stand out in the snow by ourselves, adamantly refusing that we were cold. We needed new kinds of shelter, new forms of nourishment. Funnily enough, I think that what our parents were trying to do all those years was to give us exactly this kind of protection, induct us into their tribe, which largely consists of immigrants who have spent the last several decades looking out for each other in a country that still, after so many years, is foreign to them. Our tribe is a little different, but just as necessary, because we are often just as scared to start our lives in our new avatars as our parents were to start theirs on this continent. Before I started putting this book together, I didn't fully understand the importance of finding community in women who are like me. It was through reading these essays and connecting with these women that I started to find a firm footing in a world in which the ground underneath my feet had always felt a little shaky. In editing this work, the conversations I had with these writers were priceless. We confessed deep secrets to each other. We admitted that we know that for our parents, this book represents airing the family's dirty laundry in public. It feels like such a betrayal of everything they've given us. And to us, it feels disrespectful. Even after all this time, even after our many collected rebellions, What our parents think still matters to us. How they are made to feel is still present in our consciousness. Most importantly, on both sides, there is the torture of love. The love many of our parents have for us rivals their extreme discomfort with our choices. The love we have for them, well, we can only hope it comes through on these pages, even alongside our exasperations. In these conversations, I realized this project represents the breaking of a long and deep silence. For many of us, it is the book we wished we'd had when we were going through our darkest moments. We know that the act of publicizing our rebellions feels tragic to our parents, but we hope that they understand that in doing so, we are not trying to expose them to judgment. We are just trying instead to take a positive step forward, to build a safe space for people who have been through similar experiences. Because the truth is that in most cases, those of us who purposefully moved away from the good girl mold did so with an intense sense of isolation. Those who had gone before us had kept quiet about their family lives as they had been taught to do. To transgress is one thing. To talk about the transgression is quite another. But what might our experiences have been had those people spoken up and told us that we were not alone? What this anthology has given us is the gift of a symphony of voices building around us, assuring us again and again that we have built our community, we have found our tribe. For those people who find these stories and feel close to them because they can read the experience of their own rebellions into these lines, no matter their gender identity, cultural, social, or any other kind of background, welcome. We're so glad to be in conversation with you. Our feminism is intersectional. Our fates are intertwined. For those who are coming to this volume trying to engage in these experiences in ways they never have before, thank you. Your friendship and allyship are valued more than you know. And for those who read it because they have been searching for people like us, perhaps for a very long time, I hope that with this book, we've let you in on a secret. Everything you're feeling, we have felt it too. You are not alone. We hear you, and we are here.
I almost don't really want to say anything. I feel like I've ruined what I've done before. But in the interest of paying homage to our university setting, try to have a somewhat academic conversation about things that are deeply felt. So I'm going to pose sort of very broad questions to all of you, and feel free to jump in on any of the questions that appeal to you. But what I was thinking about when I was putting this panel together is that even though each of you coming at this from different disciplinary places, what I'm intrigued as a historian is by the historical thrust of your work. But of course, the way an archivist approaches that, as opposed to a historian, as opposed to a creative writer, is different. So what I'd like to think about is, in what kinds of experience can you recuperate through purely historical or archival methods, and what gets left out, and where do you see art versus history as being complementary projects of a recovering experience?
Well, so I do not have, I'm not a historian by training. I come from a newspaper background. I used to be a newspaper reporter. And then I took on this project as someone who comes from this history, interested in her great-grandmother. But that search led me to the archives, and I did the work that historians do there. And I think what I discovered in that process, which many people before me have also discovered, is that history is not objective. And in a way, it is a fiction. It is a fiction because it's constructed from the materials available to us, which are partial and often biased. So in the writing of Cooley Woman, what I tried to do was to, yes, tell the stories that I found in the archives. And I had had a lot of material to work with. I had reports on all of the indentured voyages from India to Guyana in the 12 years before my great-grandmother landed there. And whenever something went wrong on those ships, someone, either the captain or the surgeon general who was supposed to be looking after the immigrants and their welfare, wrote it down. So these were cases of suicide, for instance, lots of cases of sexual assault on the women by various men on those ships. So I wanted to do the work of the historian, but I also wanted to sort of write about the archive itself in a way that wasn't academic and didn't use jargon, but it showed it to be sort of the fragile thing that it is and the fiction that it is. So it was, work was trying to be both history and I guess sort of artistic talk back to history. Does that answer?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, something.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit too. You know, so there are those I think that see the archive as a neutral and as a neutral space and as a static space. And believe it or not, that still is how many archivists think of their work, as we are simply neutral arbiters of what should be included, what should be preserved, and what should not be preserved. But as Gayatri was saying, the act of preserving is an incredibly political act. It's an act of decision making and of prioritizing. And so, you know, for the work that we do at WITSADA, we certainly see our role in that way. We see ourselves as active participants in the creation of what it means to be South Asian American. We see the archive as a space for empowerment. And as such, the archive is, I think, in continuous conversation with historians, with artists, with journalists. And so, you know, for example, you know, just hearing Gayatri and Piali talk today helps me think about what should be preserved in the archive, what should be included in the archive. And so, you know, I think that kind of dynamic relationship between the community and the archive is incredibly important for an archive that sees itself as part of the community and sort of being born out of the community and supporting and serving it.
Yeah, I mean, these two things are very, very interrelated, right? I mean, like, what Samit and Gayatri and I all do, and even what you do to some extent, is really at its root is storytelling, right? And so I think that I really appreciate Gayatri's comments about like how archives are themselves a certain kind of fiction, right? They are the story that are told by the victors of history. And so I think that for me, so actually, Gayatri and I are a little bit flipped in this sense in that I am actually a fiction writer and I didn't intend on writing this nonfiction book, it just sort of came out as nonfiction. And I think that both fiction and nonfiction for me have been like very interesting mediums of exploring history because in nonfiction there's so much, or I should say in fiction there's so much leeway, and I think an amazing thing that can happen with fiction is that we can imagine voices like the one that Gayatri just imagined, and we can make those voices really real to us. And I think that for a while I thought maybe nonfiction can't do that, but that's actually completely not true. Nonfiction has its own voice and has its own, like, and in some ways is able to speak to history in its own way, which I think a book like Good Girls or even a book like Who Woman really does. So yeah, I think that for me that question is really wrapped up in storytelling and how we tell stories both in the realms of fiction and nonfiction.
We can say in the word, I mean, and I of course titled the event as South Asian America, but as we've seen even in the little conversation that we've had here, the various trajectories where people from the sort of geographic mass that we're labeling South Asia, which of course has its own history of why it gets labeled South Asia, is incredibly diverse. The waves of migration that have come is very varied. The places and the languages that are spoken and the ways in which communities have constituted themselves after the migration process, through the migration process, is also very diverse. And so then the question becomes, what kind of purchase does the identity of South Asian American have when perhaps in lived practice, what matters more is, say, a community based on regional identification, or perhaps a community based on a particular wave of migration. And so why should we be defending the broader umbrella of South Asian America as a category, or do we lose that?
I mean, that's something certainly that we've had to think about a lot, being the South Asian American Digital Archive and trying to reflect an inclusive and diverse experience of South Asian Americans. I guess the way that I've thought about it is that each of us simultaneously inhabits multiple identities, right? So if you were to ask me, what are you? Sometimes people ask you that. You might say, I'm South Asian American, you might say I'm Indian American, you might say I'm Bengali, you might say all kinds of things, right? But the one identity doesn't necessarily necessitate you abandoning another, right? And so there are reasons, I think, for recognizing our shared experiences in this country, in particular. And the way to do that, I think, is to call the archive South Asian American. That's why we did that. I think.
Well, I suppose that I would identify as Indo-Caribbean. I don't think I'd ever introduce myself to someone as South Asian American. And there is a kind of unease in the relationship between Indians from the Caribbean and elsewhere, Fiji and Mauritius, and immigrants who have directly come from India. And I think some of that has to do with issues of class and also distance in time and space from India. And it is India, for the most part, for the indentured diaspora. But I think that we need to seek solidarity politically where we can. I mean, it's so necessary, and not just now in the age of Trump, but it has been so necessary. My family moved to the U.S. in 1981, and we moved to Jersey City, which is a very South Asian city, also a very Latino city, a very Filipino city. But when we moved there, we moved into a neighborhood where the dot busters were active, and this was a racist gang who were directing violence at South Indians and the Indian looking. I mean, and we fit into that category. Obviously, they were not making any distinctions between Guyanese or Indians, and
Right.
when they were writing like Hindus go home on the side of our house. So I mean, there were hate crimes happening there, and also in Queens, and there were South Asian groups that were mobilizing around those issues, giving them visibility. So in practical terms, in terms of organizing, I think that whatever solidarities we can find is just wonderful, and we can inhabit multiple identities at once.
So there are two things that I would say in response to that. The first is that so this book took me 10 years to put together, and part of the reason for that is that I was repeatedly told by the publishing industry that anthologies don't sell, and that if I had wanted to write an account of South Asian America myself, I should do that because a single author book will be much easier to sell. And I was just stunned by this advice, because I was like, that's not the point. The point is to take the pulse of a community who has never been polled before. The point is to take all the diverse representations of South Asia in the United States and in Canada and to create a chorus. That's the point. And I think that part of the reason why it took me so long to put the book together is because I wanted to be really careful, and I don't know how much I succeeded. I hope I did, but I wanted to be very careful to include every single kind of story that I could find. Now, of course, that meant finding writers who would write those stories, but I tried really hard to include stories from the model minority, stories from the undocumented force of South Asian labor in New York, and all over the country, stories from, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish background, stories from various different kinds of places in South Asia, stories from villages, stories from cities, stories from everywhere. Like as much as I could, I really tried to, not to mention like themes of stories in terms of just like violent stories to really light stories, to lighthearted stories, you know, like everything. You know, I think we really tried to put all of that into this collection, and the idea that that could have been done by one person, by one person's voice, was truly so offensive to me that like it, and that you know, that's the kind of advice that the U.S. publishing industry is still giving to writers of color, right? So that, I think to me, that, and you know, again, the South Asian American is a group of words that is on the cover of the book, and I think that the reason for that is that it was the only term that I could find that really covered the different kinds of people who I was trying to poll here. Now, is that a perfect term? Of course not. You know, like for me, I'm using the term South Asian American to mean like all of North America. I think that there are like, you know, Pakistani Canadians who would feel like that's not necessarily their term. You know, like I think that there are lots of problems with a term like this. However, the moments in which I think a term like this becomes really important is, for example, I don't know if you guys all remember this, but pretty recently, a couple of months ago, there was a court case in California about essentially erasing certain terms from California textbooks for young children regarding the South Asian community. So essentially what they were looking for, and I might get this wrong, but so don't quote me on this, but from what I can remember, what they were looking to do is that basically this was a group of upper caste, upper class, Hindu, privileged, like sort of wealthy model minority members who were looking to erase ideas of caste and casteism and ideas of sort of and frankly the idea of a pan South Asia. Like they were really looking for textbooks in California to refer to India as India and to refer to like the Hindu legacy as not being casteist and like, you know, all these different terms.
Really good for women, by the way.
And yeah, great.
Yeah.
So, you know, and there was a moment there where the New York Times published an op-ed by a 17-year-old girl who was a student in a California school system who had written saying like, my identity is not South Asian American, my identity is Indian American, my identity is Hindu American. Like she was really being very forceful about like what her identity was, and I felt like just deep sadness looking at that article because I, like, in my head I was thinking, honey, when you get to the real world and you find out how few brown women there are who are going to be in solidarity with you, you are going to need the term South Asian in a way that you don't even know right now. And so I think that, like, you know, that to me really felt like, you know, when we use more specific geographical terms, if we use them for a reason, that's great. But like, in some ways, yes, South Asian America is not a perfect term, but it is what we have.
I couldn't agree more, actually. As a historian of South Asia, who is now teaching elements of South Asian American history, it's really intriguing to me to think about the ways in which American historians write about diaspora and South Asian historians write about diaspora. And of course it's to do with this notion of these communities as diaspora in and of itself, and then of course that immediately puts it into a conversation with a nation. Right, and then the idea is that which is it? Is it oriented towards America, or is it oriented back towards South Asia? Right. So in this time with a kind of rise of virulent nationalism, both here and in South Asia, right? How do you see the community kind of treading this path in terms of constructing an identity that is really fraught on every side by these very nationalist claims, which would in many ways completely explode precisely the kinds of solidarity that we've been talking about. If we think about things like the rise of Hindus for Trump, both in America and in India, right? I mean, it seems like a moment where these kinds of affects of solidarity that we are all invested in building is really especially fragile. Guys, are you looking to take that one first? any way you want to approach it.
I don't know how to approach it except to express just deep sorrow, which is all I could do when I was looking at the Twitter feed for that Hindus for Trump concert in Jersey. I just was in shock.
But that is a part of the communities that we're talking about, right? And so then what is our response to this? I mean, how do we think about, negotiating a community identity in this moment where we're basically in between two very, very old nationalisms?
Let me know if I'm cutting you off, but I wonder if in this very difficult moment, if there are solidarities to be made that previously were not there. So, for example, I think that and this is just like one one-off article I read, maybe this is true and maybe it isn't, but I would hope that it's true, that there are marginalized communities in the United States who have been warring against each other, and warring against each other in their home countries, but also as their diasporas in the US, who are now, with one solid brush, painted demon by Trump. And so they now have to work together in a way that they haven't had to before. And so I wonder this specifically in the context of, so I've been traveling a lot with the book this semester. It came out in September, and I've been wandering around the country, reading from it in many places, and I've been really astounded by the response because, again, like I said, this was a very difficult book to put together. It came out with, a solid, mighty, but small press. And I didn't necessarily expect it to be like a bestseller or anything. And that's not necessarily what it is, but it has got a response that I was not ready for. And part of that has been, so right after the election happened, we announced one of our other reading dates, which is going to be in LA on Monday. And the Last Bookstore is hosting a reading for us, and that reading, the Facebook responses are now up in the 800s. And I'm like, you gotta understand, for an anthology published by a feminist press, by brown women, for brown women, 800 people coming to a reading does not ever happen. And that, I don't fool myself for a second into believing that it's necessarily because this is a work of genius. I know that part of it has to be because an event like that is a place for people to come together to talk about the issues not just within our community, but also the issues that our community, and I use the word "our" very broadly, that the communities are facing more generally.
Yeah, I think, so a lot of the archive comprises of historical correspondence, letters between people, who arrived in this country late 1800s or 1900s. And I'm always struck, I think, in some ways, by two things. One is that anything that it feels like we're going through now for the first time, someone was dealing with before us. And also of how much disagreement and diversity of opinion there always is, right? I think we often tend to paint history with broad brushes and imagine that everyone sort of was doing this, or everyone was believe this way. And when you sort of read through this correspondence, you see about how much disagreement there was. And so, as much as I may disagree with it personally, Hindus for Trump is a reflection of what's happening in the South Asian American community today, and it's worth understanding and acknowledging and recognizing and opposing. But worth, I think, acknowledging. For us to just brush it over, I think would miss out on something that's really important that's happening, and not just in the community, but in the world.
I'm happy to kind of open it up for questions now. Anybody who wants to? Yeah.
I have a question for Daitra. So I was wondering, I'm also, as you know, Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese. And I was curious, like, I've read your book like multiple times and I've been to a few of your readings, so I was just wondering, like, how easy is it to sort of replicate your, like, quest for finding out, like, your, you know, origin and sort of, like, your ethnic origin in India? And I was wondering, like, was there any sort of jumping off point, or was there anything that made it easy for you to be able to trace your ancestry back to India? Because for me, I don't have, like, a direct link back to India. Like, I know people from, like, word of mouth that, like, my great-great-grandfather on my mom's side possibly came from India, but I don't even know how I would start and embark on, like, finding that ancestry and, like, where I would go in order to do that. And then my question's also, like, twofold, because I recently, I got a ancestry DNA test for my dad. Because I was always curious about, like, finding out, like, what the breakdown was, and it was, like, a huge circle, like 80% South Asia, and then there was, like, 12% East Asia, which was something I totally didn't expect. But I know that there were also Chinese indentured servants also in Guyana, so I was curious about, like, if it would be possible, or if you've ever thought about finding, like, sort of like your, like, if there were any other, you know, races that were possibly in your own family, if it was possible to find that out as well.
Well, to tackle your first question
Mhm.
first, you could sort of work your way backwards using birth certificates.
Yeah.
I was fortunate because my father's father was the son born on that ship from
Yeah.
India,
Mhm.
the Clyde. So, you know, his birth certificate, and my father just knew anyway, had Lal Bahadur, born on the Clyde, 1903. So I was just very fortunate, and I was able to actually trace almost all of my ancestors, meaning to find their immigration passes, which had all kinds of information about them, including village of origin, next of kin, back there, caste, identifying marks. And you might be able to get it by working backwards through birth certificates.
Right, but you had the birth certificates already, or did you?
Well, my father just knew 1903 the
Okay.
Clyde, so I was able to go to the National Archives in Guyana and
So you knew
get the
the
book
ship
of the Clyde for
and-
1903 and look
Got
through all
it.
the immigration passes and see
Okay.
hers.
But if you
And-
didn't have the birth certificate, you would still have to go there and sort of.
Well, the birth certificates are a way to work your way back to the ancestor who left India,
Right.
and that hopefully would tell you what ship and what year, and from that you could go
Okay.
to the archives.
I see, yeah.
But, so a big part of my book is about relationships between Indian women on the plantations and overseers. So Indian women on the plantations were in a minority. They left India at a ratio of 40 women to every 100 men. So all sorts of fights over women broke out on the plantations, and there were overseers who exercised their right. So I think that probably a fair proportion of Guyanese Indians do have come from different backgrounds. They have Scots overseers in them, and in more cases than are acknowledged, also relationships with the descendants of former African slaves, plantations. In terms of whether I want that quantified by a DNA test,
Yeah, I don't even know how
Yeah.
accurate it is, it's based on
right?
like a
I think I don't need it. I'm comfortable accepting the
Mhm.
fact that we come
yeah.
from multiple identities, and I'm sure I've got a whole lot going on. We all do.
Any other questions? Sorry, Henry, is that you?
Hi, Nanya, it's me.
I can't actually see your hands, I wasn't sure.
You need new glasses? I
Alright.
can say something though,
Yeah.
if that's welcome.
Yes.
My name is Schwartz, and my family has tried to convince itself for generations that we're Catholic, which is interesting working at Georgetown, because everyone knows I'm Jewish. except my family, who can't wrap their head around the fact that Schwartz is or was a Jewish name, and that for many various reasons, people who were persecuted in Central Europe in a specific time frame had to change their identities and convert or suffer consequences. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened in my family. But my family are convinced that they're Irish Catholic, and they go to church, and they mispronounce the last name in order to disguise the hard T that really gives it away as a Jewish name. That's weird. I mean, that's just really weird. So the other thing is that my father's sister married an immigrant Italian whose family also goes back 3 generations in the U.S. And they are diehard Republicans, just rabid. And they don't want any immigration into the country. They want to close the doors. They despise brown people, which is very common in the New York area. There's a lot of bigotry among such a diverse immigrant population. My cousin has a bumper sticker on the back of his SUV with the tinted windows. On one side, Grateful Dead, and on the other, Donald Trump. So, identity is really confusing and really contradictory. Maybe, well, I don't want to say especially, but for white folk, it's very problematic in these immigrant towns like New York City, where my people are from. How identity develops and how Americanness gets conjured, and at whose expense and who's excluded, and it's constantly changing. So I've recently been working much more on diaspora and indenture and large-scale immigration in the 19th century. And so it just occurs to me that, as you said, we're all really complicated.
No, just to follow up with that, what I've been pondering is what will all of these stories mean for the next generation? For my daughter, who's half white, and will she take it upon herself to go to the digital archives and try to find something about herself? I don't know.
And it's funny, because we worked together and I was with a very similar comment. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much. I thought the conversation is very enlightening. For you specifically,
Yeah.
Yali, brilliant titling of the book. I just have to say that because that was honestly part of the reason I came today, because I think it's rare to find a phrase like that that pretty much summarizes so much of what so many of us felt growing up. It's funny, it makes you want to learn more, and I was thinking the same thing. I mean, the things that many of us probably in this room at least, rebelled against in the context of what we were raised in terms of the philosophies, the ideology, and the conflict of that in relation to having the respect and understanding how much our parents had to sacrifice, as they told us often, to come to this country. And I'm curious, I haven't read your stories yet, I'm curious if you think this next generation of particularly girls, and mine are also half Indian, half not, do you see that our generation is kind of repeating the same philosophies even though we rebelled against them? Or do you feel a real shift in thinking? I mean, especially with the caste system and its overlays, and as much as many of us oppose that, we're really central to how we viewed people when we went back to the homeland, or, I'm just curious what you see.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you also for your comments about the title, because I feel like, so I sat with this title in my head for like 10 years, right? And then I thought it was kind of funny, but I wasn't aware of how people were going to react to it. And for the most part, people have had this reaction, right? Good Girls Night, it doesn't mean anything, right? It's just like a code word for a set of behaviors and a set of expectations that we all understand, and therefore we're like, oh yeah, but there, I've also had reactions. I get either the reaction from they see women doctors that are like, well, I became a doctor. And I'm like, yeah, I know, exactly. Or I get the reaction from random men on the internet being like, what do bad girls do? It's one of those two things. But thank you for the comment, because I do think that it sums up a lot of different things. Having said that, I think that it's really interesting to watch South Asian America develop. And I think we're really still watching it, because for most of us who comprise of like modern South Asian America, we're only one generation in, really, right? And so we're still, for the most part, we're still from the generation who had parents who grew up in the home country, right? And so I think that it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when those of us who were born and raised in the West start having children and start raising those children, and as those children grow up. Because I think that one of the things that has happened, potentially unfortunately, within South Asian America is that South Asian America of my generation, and I'm in my 30s, like I feel like that generation, with some very notable exceptions and with a decent underground presence of us, for the most part is a pretty conservative generation. It's a generation that has been taught that making money is of the utmost importance. And I'm not criticizing that. I understand where that comes from. Like in South Asia, it's do or die, right? Like it's 1 billion people. Like you either like kill it or get killed. Like that is how it is, right? And so like I understand where that mentality comes from. It was certainly a mentality that my own parents had. And I think that a lot of us who didn't like become doctors or marry doctors or like do the thing got a lot of flack for it. And those of us who did sort of like move on in that vein, I think we have a very interesting sort of social liberalism where I find that most South Asian Americans my generation are like totally cool with like women's rights and gay rights and trans rights and like maybe even Black Lives Matter, like, you know, all of those things, but like are generally very conservative when it comes to, for example, religion. And caste. And I think that part of that is that, you know, my generation of South Asian Americans tends to relate to South Asia through the religion of their parents, and so I think religion starts playing in this community's minds in a way that scares me a little bit. And you know, I think that our generation of South Asian America doesn't necessarily do a lot to interrupt the status quo, because the status quo works for us. We're the model minority, like, you know, we're good, you know, and so I think that we tend to ignore the entire stream of South Asian migration to the US, which is not documented, which is not privileged, which is not going to Harvard and Yale all the time, you know, like that stream of South Asian migration is very interesting to me, because that stream is in some ways looking to become the model minority. Like they are also looking to replicate something which the model minority itself is continuously replicating. And so, I don't know, I'm very interested to see what this generation does and what the children of this generation do, but I worry sometimes that there are not enough of us.
May I add something to that? I mean, right before the election, there was this article which said that the largest stream of undocumented immigrants now coming to the US are from South Asia. And part of me, I was like, try building that wall. But more importantly, actually, that I think that that's going to have serious consequences for what it means to be South Asian American. Because actually, for a lot of the history of South Asians in the US, they were not documented. They were not allowed to take citizenship. And so it's only very recently, really, that this notion of a legally recognized model minority community has been there. And actually the larger stream of South Asian history is not of that.
Right.
And so I think it's going to be sort of interesting, and now, especially with these new waves of migration that are coming in, of how we're going to actually negotiate distinctions of legality and illegality, distinctions of class, and distinctions of really time spent within the U.S. And so I think all of that is going to have to play out, and it's something that, I mean, all of us in various ways are invested in thinking through it and building solidarities around as well. Because we're going to have to come together to protect many of the more vulnerable members of our communities. So we're out of time, and I wanted to thank everybody for being here, and thank you especially to all our guests, and it's really been such a pleasure. I wanted to make a plug for another event on South Asian America. that my colleague Marcia Shatlin will be convening on Monday. Vivek Bald, the author of Bengali Harlem, will be speaking at the History of the Intersections. That's at 4 p.m. on Walsh 499. And so if you sign up with me, then we'd be able to pass on that information as well. But thank you again, and thank you all of you for